So your team is missing the Stanley Cup playoffs. What now? Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Theory of Hockey Show. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that is taking time out of their busy week in the final week of the NHL's regular season to make time for our show. In the lead up to this upcoming weekend, as these playoff series begin to get locked in, I will do a video breaking down each playoff series as they get clinched. As of right now, the only guaranteed one we have is Dallas and Minnesota. And as the week progresses, as teams lock into playoff spots, more will come into clarity. But on today's show, we are going to be discussing the alternative. We are going to be breaking down the teams missing the playoffs and the lens in which self-growth is important, the lens in which you can really learn and adjust your expectations, what's realistic. And the reason I think this is important, there are always going to be down years in the life cycle of anything macro, anything big picture. We are always going to have lulls. You know, it's funny, they were talking about this on the broadcast during a Mets game, I believe it was last week, where they were talking about the 5-ish months of a Major League Baseball season. And the difference between a good and a great player is a great player has 2 good months, 2 bad months. And then the great players consistently, that third month, which usually divides the line between good and great, they're also good in that third month. So 3 out of 5 months you would classify as good. And then the other 2 you would classify as less than. But when you average out all the numbers, the 3 months being better than the 2 ultimately gives said player good numbers. We can do a very similar conversation when it comes to NHL teams, especially because there is such a mushy middle this year. I think you look at the state of the New York Rangers this year and the month by month, they're relatively in the mix. And that was going to be ahead in my segments later, but I figured it was worth talking about now. So in October, the Rangers go 5-5-2. Fine. They go 8-7 in November, 6-6-3 in December. 3-10-1 in January sinks their season. Going 3-10-1 in the month of January effectively ends the Rangers season. February, there's only 3 games because of the Olympics. They go 1-1-1. March, 8-6-2 again, right there, right at about that 500 mark. And then April, so far, 2-3-0. They have 2 games remaining, one of which Jonathan Quick will make his final NHL start. And I bring that up because the season is a grind. The season is taxing. At this point, if you're a team that's consistently in the playoffs, you are usually only getting a 3-month off season. And that's if you go to a second round. You know, our playoffs are starting about a week later than they usually would this year because the Olympics pushed everything back a week or 2. And let's say you're an average NHL team. Let's say you are going on a playoff run. Your season effectively started 6 months prior. Usually, if you don't live in the city you play in, you're going to come back to that city first or second week of September. You'll probably do some informal workouts. I know a lot of teams do what's called a captain skate, where the captain will organize informal activities because the team has restrictions on when they are allowed to do mandatory events. But generally, it's good practice to show up to those. So let's say middle of September, you are in training camp at that point. You're running your couple practices. For the most part now, preseason hockey is relatively academic. Most teams have a pretty finite idea of what their roster is going to look like on opening night. And most teams are at the most having maybe 3 or 4 spots up for grabs in their lineup, maybe a backup goalie situation, maybe who's going to be your 7th defenseman. But a lot of teams go into the year with a pretty finalized idea of who's going to make the team. And the preseason now is effectively about conditioning. It's about getting guys up to game speed. Sometimes it's about auditioning chemistry. If there's a new coach, it's system implementation. But you get that going mid-September. We start our season first or second week of October, depending on how the calendar falls. We play October, November, December, January. We play 4 months. And then we have an all-star break in February. This year we had an Olympic break. We get a week or 2 for that. The rest of February, all of March, the first week or 2 of April. We are at a 6.5-ish month season before we've even started the playoffs. And that 82-game regular season, and we're going up to 84 this upcoming year, as most of you probably know, we're contracting preseason games and we're adding on 2 more regular season games. You are going to fall into one of four boxes as a team every single year. You're either rebuilding, developing, competing, or contending. I think you can put all 32 teams into one of those four boxes. I think being honest with which one of those four boxes your team falls into is a trap a lot of general managers struggle with. I think you look at a season like this one in particular, you look at the bottom half of the Western Conference, where teams as dead as the Nashville Predators and the Los Angeles Kings are still somehow hanging around in the playoff conversation. I mean, the Jets, up until Friday, the Jets, who were in last place in the West at one point this year, were in the playoff mix as recently as last week. And anytime the bottom half is as bad as it is this year, and the East is better in terms of points, the cutoff line is going to be in the mid to high 90s, which is better than the West, where the cutoff point might only be 87 or 88. I think teams really fall into the trap of anything can happen if we can get in the playoffs. And when you have as compressed and congested of standings as you do in a year like this, some teams will not be honest with why they failed. They will not be honest with why they were in the position they were in. And instead, they will look at the finished product. There will be a general manager around the league who finishes the first or second spot out of a wild card. You know, you look at where perhaps the Islanders and Matthew Darche are, year one of Darche. The Islanders, by all accounts, overachieved this year. They spent a majority of the regular season in a playoff spot. With a handful of games to go, they desperately fired Patrick Waugh, brought in Pete DeBoer in hopes of trying to limp their way to the finish line, getting into the playoffs and solving their problems later. And I think the Islanders are a good example of this, of a team not really understanding where they are in their life cycle. I think the Islanders are in what I would call somewhere between the rebuilding and the developing stage because of some of their individual talents. Ilya Sorokin, who I don't know if the Vezina Trophy is going to end up going his way this year. For a good chunk of the year, I would have said yes, but I do think being that GMs vote on that award and wins and losses ultimately come up, I think the fact that Sorokin and the Islanders are going to miss the playoffs might be held against him. I could see a world where maybe Jeremy Swayman or Andrei Vasilevsky take home that award. You add in Matthew Schaefer, who had the best rookie season I have seen as somebody working in hockey media. And I was a kid for Ovechkin and Sid. McDavid, of course, had a really good first 40 games, and then he broke his collarbone. I think Celebrini was pretty good last year. He took a massive leap. Bedard, no. Nathan McKinnon, no. Austin Matthews had a very good rookie season, sure. But Schaefer, Sorokin, Bo Horvat, really strong seasons. Matthew Barzal stays healthy for the first time in quite a while. He has a pretty solid season as well. But the bottom half of that roster, the defense, a real disconnect between the vision for the front office and the coaching staff under Patrick Waugh. Waugh understanding that he could not win with a lockdown defensive approach with the defensemen he had. The Islanders defense has dealt with a litany of injuries this year. Guys like Mayfield, Pulak, Pelech have all missed time. They went out and traded for Carson Soucy from the Rangers. Soucy was dreadful as an Islander, finishing well below 50% in goal share for somebody who was only there for a month or so. And for about 2 months. He got traded relatively close to the trade deadline, but Carson Soucy is a good example of what I talk about. And Carson Soucy, as an Islander, was outscored 21-10 in 400 minutes. So more than 2-1 outscored in his tenure as an Islander. And that's a team that got a little too hyped, got a little too confident, if you will, and where it was going, and ultimately missed the postseason. Now, it is not fatal. I think the Islanders have more than enough of a foundation to reapproach how their offseason goes. Maybe they try and jettison a problem contract or two and try and get a little bit younger, get a little bit cheaper. But this was a missed opportunity. And when you're in those windows, rebuilding, competing, developing, contending, I think you look at the New York Rangers, who are going to be the majority of this episode because it's the team I have the most innate understanding of, and I have the most baseline of comprehension for why this season didn't work. And I think there are really good examples in some of the decision-making processes that lead you to how they got here. And number one, you have to be honest with your expectations. Honesty is, especially with yourself, is such a challenge in leadership roles in sports, because you being honest with yourself is not always going to be in your best interest. If you're a general manager and your owner calls you in to sit down and talk about how your season's going, and you come out and say, well, the guys aren't playing well, player X, player Y, player Z are all underperforming, here's why. All your owner, who probably isn't that hockey sensed, isn't as in tune with the sport as you are, doesn't have as material and understanding as you are, is going to nod as he listens to your explanation. He's going to say, then why am I signing their checks if they're underperforming? How do we get them to play better? And I think the Rangers are a really good example of this, because last year was supposed to be the come to Jesus moment. The Rangers entered last year coming off of a President's Trophy season, the best season in 100 years of Rangers hockey in terms of regular season results. And they had on paper a better top nine. They had Riley Smith in the Blake Wheeler role. They had more or less had the same team from the President's Trophy season, sans Eric Gustafsson. But last year's Rangers team entirely self-implodes. And early on, too, Trouba is abysmal. Jacob Trouba, as a Ranger, gets outscored 17-23. He has a 43% goal share in the 2-ish months Jacob Trouba is on the Rangers last year. This comes on the heels of Trouba being reportedly shopped at the deadline at the NHL draft in the summer before, which of course the Rangers deny ever happening and Trouba denies ever happening. But we heard those reports by more than one source. Both Emily Kaplan and Elliot Friedman reported it. So I would like to believe that that was at least somewhat in motion. Trouba shows up. He's terrible. He's unplayable. Great. You managed to get rid of Barclay Goodrow, who was making $3.6 million against the cap for free. The Sharks took him. You did not have to pay assets to make his money go away. You had, at the pretext, $11 million there. Then, in season, as it starts to go off the tracks, where they go on that spell where they go 6-15 from mid-November through the end of December, and they are one of the worst teams in the NHL. When they go through that spell, Capo Caco gets made the sacrificial lamb in mid-December. And he says, and he was right at the time, and I wholeheartedly believe it when he said it, I might not be playing well, but I am not the worst offender here. I am not the reason we are playing bad hockey. And he got healthy scratched. He got traded within a day to Seattle for Will Borgen. And this brings me to one of our first points of honesty and reflection. A lot of teams are guilty of only trying to upgrade based on their own self-perceptions. Good example. The Rangers went out and got Will Borgen to effectively be their Jacob Trouba replacement. They got Will Borgen on the pretext that this is a physically talented player, and Borgen skates very well. He's got a plus size trait for what he does. And on paper, it's reasonable to believe that someone like Will Borgen could play better in a better environment. If you go back and watch, I did about 45 minutes of video about this the day the trade happened in December of 2024. Borgen on paper is an interesting gamble. He was somebody who 4 years of college hockey, a bit of a slow burn to make it at the NHL level, had really one good underlying number season in Seattle where he played a lot with Carson Soucy, as a matter of fact, which was part of the pretext for Carson Soucy and him being not the Rangers' second pair this year, which was part of the impetus for the Rangers to go out and trade for Carson Soucy last year ahead of the trade deadline. And someone like Borgen, who not a big track record for somebody who was 28 years old when the Rangers acquired him. He had less than 300 career NHL games because of the amount of time he had spent in college. And anytime you are taking on a player based on projection, there's the possibility you're wrong. And projecting how a player is going to translate from point A to point B is one of the real challenges in hockey today, because we don't have the resources and the tools the other sports do. I can figure out if a hitter is going to translate well in a new environment. Do they walk a lot? Do they hit for power? Are they a contact hitter? All of those little things can tell you a lot about the value of a player. What's their swing velocity? What's their launch angle? There are a lot of traits that are sticky when it comes to baseball production. In football, I can get a reasonable understanding of how a player is going to perform in a system based on usage in other offenses and the role they're going to be asked to play in their new situation. But in hockey, where so few players are good enough individually to overcome their environment, a lot of times the environment is going to win out. For a player like Will Borgen, who has individual traits, he does well. He skates very well for someone his size and as a defenseman. Traditionally, defensemen don't skate as well, especially on the bigger side. But Borgen, as one of these newer generation guys, moves very well. But one of the real problems with players like that, by the time a player's 28, that's more or less who they are. It is very challenging to get a player at that stage of their NHL career and change them and mold them and divert their path. Now, there are outliers. There are players who maybe don't break out until 26, 27, 28. In the case of former Ranger Chris Kreider, he didn't hit that 30-goal mark until he was already out of his 30s. It happens from time to time, where a guy gets the exact right confluence of circumstances in his environment, and it enables him to have that massive leap in statistical production. I wanted to talk about Borgen specifically because Will Borgen represented a clear upgrade from Jacob Trouba. We said it a few minutes ago. In the time Jacob Trouba was on the Rangers last year, he was outscored 23-17. He had a 43% goal share. Will Borgen, in the December, January, February, March, April, 5 months he was on the Rangers, he had an even goal share. Will Borgen, 39 goals for, 39 goals against. Second pair on a bad team, that's good. To be a 50% goal share player on an actively bad team, that's an accomplishment. That is something that gave the Rangers an indication, at least, okay, this guy might be usable. Now, I have real issues with the Rangers' process of giving him an extension 17 games into his time as a Ranger because it demonstrates preordained. It tells you that the Rangers had made up their mind before Will Borgen ever played a game for them, that all they wanted was to reaffirm their prior perspectives, limited sample, and he was fine with K'Andre Miller in those 17 games. They had a positive goal share and they had a modestly positive expected goal share, which for a bad Rangers team was an improvement on what they were getting from Jacob Trouba. But now you look at this a year later, the Rangers are once again a bottom 5 team in the NHL. They are going to have somewhere between the 4th and 7th best odds to win the first overall pick in the draft lottery, depending on how these final 2 regular season games shake out and how the teams around them in that lottery world do. This year, as a Ranger, Will Borgen has been outscored 42-43. Again, not grading, not atrocious, but Will Borgen is not somebody who should have been viewed as a foundational piece. He was a gamble, an upside play, somebody that the Rangers identified as maybe we can find some excess value here. And unequivocally, Borgen over the last 130, 140 games as a Ranger has been better than what Jacob Trouba was in his previous 140 games as a Ranger. That's a win. Will Borgen is better than Jacob Trouba at this stage of their respective careers. Now, the problem for the Rangers is that Will Borgen might be better than Jacob Trouba, but he's also not good enough to drive his own pair. And you look at where the Rangers are at right now, especially on the back end, and I could stand to argue they need as many as 3 new defensemen on that back end, if not 4. I am not a Will Borgen believer. I think on a good team, Will Borgen is a 3rd pair defenseman. I think Will Borgen is playing the Oliver Ekman-Larsson role on the Florida Panthers 2 years ago. I think he is your 5th or 6th defenseman. I think he needs to play with a partner who's a bit more physical and can do a bit more of the dirty work, clearing the net front, tying up sticks, winning 50-50 pucks. And you can probably get pretty good results out of him. But the Rangers have had Borgen in-house for 2 years now, and he's been about a break-even defenseman over the span of those 2 years. And you'll recall last year, he spent quite a bit of time with K'Andre Miller. This year, he's played with Braden Schneider. This year, he's played with Carson Soucy. And at no point over the course of these previous 80 regular season games, and I know Morgan missed a few weeks with injury, and he's really struggled since coming back from that injury. At no point did I feel like the Rangers had made progress on their defensive issues. Now, did the Rangers get credit for Vladislav Gavrikov being very good when he's played with Adam Fox? Of course. That is a massive win. That is a defensive defenseman, first pair guy. Sets a career high in goals at 14. He fills in admirably for Adam Fox as the team's best defenseman while Fox was out. But you look at the difference in Gavrikov's play with Adam Fox versus with Braden Schneider, and you get a drastically different picture. In the time Gavrikov played with Braden Schneider, which is about 500 minutes, which is a consequential sample size, the Rangers were outscored 2-1. In the 500 plus minutes Gavrikov plays with Braden Schneider, the Rangers are outscored 28-14. They are unplayable together, but because of the situation the Rangers are in, where the defense is largely piecemealed together, you get the unfortunate reality that the Rangers had their one bad month in January. They had their one bad month at the most crucial juncture of the season because it was in the lead up to the Olympic break where the perceptions around teams were going to calcify going into the trade deadline. Think about that for a second. You had 3 games in the month of February. And then the following week, we come out of that Olympic break, and we're at the trade deadline already on March 5th. And you have to make a knee-jerk decision on your team. Ultimately, the Rangers trade Panarin at the end of January. And it's a good move in the sense that it opens opportunities. And I think this is my biggest frustration with the Rangers specifically this year. It's not just that they were actively bad and they were supposed to be good this year. You know, they went out and signed Gavrikov. They made moves for guys like Taylor Radish. Last year, they had signed Sam Carrick under the pretext that they were going to compete this year. Part of the reason they traded for Carson Soucy last year was the idea that he was going to be part of a defensive overhaul that was going to get this team back to the postseason. They went out and hired Mike Sullivan, who Chris Drury has wanted to hire for 4 years, under the pretext that this team was ready to compete. Remember, Mike Sullivan works out that exit plan in Pittsburgh because the Penguins have embraced a rebuild. Mike Sullivan was very clear that he did not want to be a part of that over in Pittsburgh. Now, I'm sure the money in New York helps. I'm sure getting paid the highest rate of any coach in the entire NHL can dull the pain of the team being bad quite a bit. But at the same time, I got nothing from this season. And what I mean by that, it's okay to be bad. Part of the life cycle of an NHL team is having bad seasons. Even good teams are going to have down years. The Florida Panthers, who have gone to 3 straight finals and won 2 of them, they're going to miss the playoffs this year, and they're going to have a 5 to 10% chance, depending on where they finish in the standings, of picking first overall. The Dallas Stars last decade, they missed the playoffs the 1 year. They draft Miro Heiskanen and Jason Robertson and Rope Hintz and Jake Ottinger all in a 2-year window, and they're right back in the mix. The Capitals had the down year 2 years ago where the Rangers had them cannon fodder in the first round, and then they bounced back last year. It is a natural point in cycles where you're going to bottom out. And last year was the opportunity for the Rangers to look themselves in the mirror and say, we're not good enough. There is no Band-Aid fixing here. Our team lacks the talent to win consistently. We need to reassess. And instead of doing that, the Rangers doubled down on last year's team by effectively just adding Gavrikov, hiring Mike Sullivan, and assuming a new coach and a modestly better defense would be enough. And the downside of the Rangers season being so segmented the way it was, where only January was the egregiously bad month, there will be a vocal contingent of people who cover the team who will reiterate the fact that the Rangers, without Shesterkin, without Adam Fox, had their worst month of the season. But otherwise, they were right around the bubble. And finishing with 86, 87 standings points as opposed to where they're at right now, that would have been worse. Unequivocally, it would have been a lot worse had the Rangers limped along and finished middle of the pack, third team out of the playoffs and not ended up with a top 6 or 7 pick in this upcoming draft. But my biggest gripe here is that not only did the team effectively waste an entire year of primes from Adam Fox and Igor Shesterkin, both of whom, when they've played, have been the Rangers' 2 best players this year. And I don't want to hear it about Zibanejad. Zibanejad's having a nice season. You look at what happened the month he was the only good player on the team and tell me with a straight face he was better or more valuable than Shesterkin or Fox this year. Come on, let's be adults here. Our goal when we are not in a contending status, when we're not Colorado, we're not Dallas, when we're not at the top of the mountain, our goal is to figure out how we get there. And for a lot of teams, that is a non-linear process, meaning some years you'll be closer, some years you'll be further away. And I think a lot of teams are going to talk themselves into, well, maybe we're the Bruins. Maybe we're the Capitals, famously the Bruins, who missed the playoffs last year. They take James Higgins in the top 10. They overachieved this year. Jeremy Swayman has a very nice year. Morgan Geekie goes crazy the first 4 months of the year. They have enough to bounce back. They take advantage of the power vacuum in the Eastern Conference when simultaneously the Rangers, Devils, Islanders, Panthers all regress. There were opportunities this year. Buffalo and Pittsburgh and the Flyers, the beneficiaries. Toronto as well took a step back this year. There were more opportunities for teams who haven't been in the playoffs in a while to get back into the conversation. But if you're the Rangers, you could have made this season a lot more productive. And what I mean by that, I don't even care about the wins and losses at a certain point because you got to play the games. You're not going to not play the games. At the end of January, going into the Olympic break, you trade Panarin. You could have traded Trocheck. You ultimately didn't. You think you're going to get a better offer this summer, maybe at the draft, maybe closer to free agency. We'll see. But you had guys in the organization who could have gotten run. Number one, why did the Rangers insist on playing Matt Rempe for 26 miserable games? Rempe broke a finger in his hand midway through the season. He was out for quite a while. He came back. He was horrendously ineffective, and he's been on LTIR ever since. He's only played 26 games this year. Rempe averaged .836 per game this year. He broke a finger. He had 4 games this year where he played more than 10 minutes. Why were the Rangers playing an injured Matt Rempe over any of the young guys who have come up over the last 2 or 3 weeks? You look at Yaroslav Hamalesh, who looks to be an NHL fourth liner at the minimum. Maybe there's a bit more of a ceiling there, and he plays his way into a top 9 role in the course of training camp, preseason, and the start of next year. That would be great. You look at the willingness they've had to give Noah Laba the opportunity he's earned, and I have been relatively pleased. I think Laba probably tops out as a third-line center, but at the very least, that's an in-house guy who got 65, 70 games of NHL experience and took it on the chin. It's really important that these guys get immersed in being on an NHL team early on and figure out what they can get away with. The sooner a guy makes their NHL debut, the more runway they're going to have. The longer it takes you to break through that ceiling, make your NHL debut, find consistent starting ice time, I think the chances of you working out as an NHLer dramatically decrease. I think you look no further than someone like Brennan Othmann, who the Rangers were very optimistic about at the end of last year, gave him an opportunity to make the team at a training camp, ultimately didn't live up to those expectations. They traded him in effectively an AHL for AHL trade to the Calgary Flames. And it's to be decided if Brennan Othmann is going to be a 200 gamer in the NHL. It doesn't seem like his skating is where it needs to be. It doesn't seem like his hockey sense gets him where he needs to be. You look at how someone like an Adam Sikora has played over the last 3 weeks. And I know Sikora's only been in the NHL for a cup of coffee, but those are the types of players who are what you want to be about in these transition periods. Not just for the hockey, because do I think Hamalesh, Sikora, and Noah Laba are going to be high-end impact NHLers? No. I think at best, all three of those guys are going to top out as third liners. But as we have seen the last 5 to 10 years in New York Ranger land, third and fourth liners often sink this team because they get caught up in the Ryan Reeves, the Matt Rempe's. They are so preoccupied with what third and fourth liners have looked like historically. Barclay Goodrow, of course. They miss out on opportunities. And I think all three of those guys have a role on a winning Rangers team 2 to 4 years from now as bottom sixers. And they're all young. They're all cheap. It'll be about getting them games and figuring it out. I think anytime they were sending out Rempe and Edstrom out there, and look, I can afford Edstrom a little more grace because he's dealt with quite a few injuries over the years, and he's really had a hard go of staying in the lineup consistently. But the Rangers sent him and Rempe out there a lot with Carrick in the first third of this season and got moderately passable results. But I struggle. It would have been infinitely more encouraging that if the Rangers are going to lose consistently for the better part of this year, where they're going to finish as a bottom 5 to 8 team in the league, get your young guys game reps. Why are we playing Matt Rempe, whose ceiling is 11 minutes per game in the NHL? Why are we playing Adam Edstrom, somebody who we cannot keep healthy and in the lineup? Why can't we just give why did you sign Taylor Radish in the offseason? Why didn't you have that spot penciled in for Gabe Perreault to start the year? And look, Perreault, who we're going to talk about in a minute, has been great since the return to play from the Olympics. He's been one of the Rangers' best players. He's been one of the Rangers' most exciting players. And someone like Perreault, these games are an opportunity to figure out what you can get away with at the NHL level in a low-stakes environment. And I do think that matters to some degree because you want these guys playing. Someone like Perreault, there is a very defined ceiling of what he can accomplish at the AHL level or previously at the college hockey level. And I don't think it's a coincidence, once again, that a young Rangers prospect with a lot of potential and who looks the part of NHLer has spent an extended period of time playing college hockey or hockey outside of the Rangers organization. I want to walk you through this real quick because this is a really important point. Mika Zibanejad spent the first 3 years of his career with the Senators organization. Chris Kreider spent 2.5 years at Boston College. Jimmy Vesey spent 4 years at Harvard. Kevin Hayes spent 4 years at Boston College. Brady Shea spent 3 years at Minnesota. Keandre Miller spent 3 years at Wisconsin. Adam Fox spent multiple years at Harvard. Jacob Trouba, other organizations, and multiple years of college hockey. You look at Artemi Panarin, multiple years in the KHL, then the Blackhawks, then the Blue Jackets. Trocheck, Carolina, Florida, Carolina, the Rangers. And all of this is to say, the further you are away from the Ranger organization, in particular what the Hartford project has been much of the last decade, the better your chances of working out. The only real guy who spent an extended period of time in Hartford that looked to be a decent NHLer was Filipino, and Filipino ultimately might end up being medically retired after this season. We'll see how things go for him in Vancouver, if he can return to play, if the Canucks will allow him to return to play. But I bring that up because it's not a coincidence Perreault looks the part. It's not a coincidence that he looks to be a pretty solid NHLer now because he didn't spend his age 19 and 20 seasons trying to figure it out in the OHL and then going to Hartford and then 2 years in Hartford and then getting called up at 22. I think the fact he demonstrated a baseline competency in college and then the AHL in his limited stints there, it was going to work out. But the Rangers could have had him up all year on a bad team and just allowed him to take his lumps. But it's not until Panarin gets traded that he ultimately gets to make that leap. I bring it up because prior to the Olympics, Perreault plays 15.58 per game over 24 games. He has 3 goals, 5 assists. Since the return to play from the Olympics, the Rangers have played 23 games. Perreault has averaged 2 full more minutes per game, 17.58. He has 7 goals and 10 assists over the last 23 games. He's got a 58% goal share, a 52% expected goal share, a 54% high danger chance share. All of those numbers are really good. All of those numbers, in conjunction with how Zibanejad and how Lafreniere have played with Perreault, lead you to believe that this is, at the minimum, a top 6 player in the NHL. Now, what his ceiling is ultimately is largely going to be defined by his teammates. He is not a world-class skater in the vein of a McKinnon, a Barzal, a McDavid, a Jack Hughes. The individually great players, they can create a lot of offense for themselves and for their line mates purely based off of their transition play, their ability to carry the puck into the offensive zone with speed and then either attack the net, set up the 2 on the odd man rush, look for that cross seam pass, leave it for a trailer, drive the net yourself, or sustain possession. For someone like Perreault, who's going to need help in transition because he's not a world-class skater, a lot of his ceiling is going to be tied to that, and it's going to be tied to the Ranger power play. You have seen the difference in the games the Rangers have played with Adam Fox and without on the man advantage. Effectively twice as good with Adam Fox as without him. And Perreault has done a reasonable enough job on the power play that I think he's going to end up there. And in the context of this conversation about young players and opportunities, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Matthew Robertson's role this year. And someone like Matthew Robertson is a really good case study for what I'm talking about. You can only understand what a player is by giving them time. Now, some players just don't have it, and some teams are a little quicker to pull the plug than others. I think about how the Rangers were very quick to give up on Vitaly Kravtsov, on Nils Lundqvist, on Lias Andersson for varying reasons. All 3 of those guys are not a monolith. They all got moved for varying reasons. They all struggled for different reasons. But I think anytime a guy less than 100 games in as a highly drafted first round guy and the team pulls the plug and trades them, they liquidate them, I think that tells you they didn't see much of a vision for them. But someone like Robertson, who's 25 years old this year, 70 of his 72 career NHL games are this year. You think about all of the different defensemen the Rangers have brought in the span of the last 5 years, where you look at Patrick Nemeth and Justin Braun and Nico Mikkola and Ben Harper, and Eric Gustafsson and Carson Soucy. You think about all of the different players the Rangers have brought in for that role, the third pair left-handed defenseman spot. At any point, the Rangers could have given Matthew Robertson an opportunity. But this year, with no other options, with injuries, with players struggling, the Rangers had their hand forced and had to give Matthew Robertson NHL ice time. And has he been incredible or world-beating? No. He's been outscored 45-40. He's got a 50% expected goal share. He skates reasonably okay. He's got passable NHL puck skills. There is nothing about Matthew Robertson that leads me to believe he is anything more than a 5th or 6th defenseman. But the Rangers had this guy in-house. What did they do last year instead? They got Calvin DeHaan. They got Carson Soucy. At any point last year, post-trade deadline, when they traded Ryan Lindgren and they had left-handed lineup spots available, they could have given Matthew Robertson a look. This year, the Rangers, with limited options, gave Matthew Robertson a look, and they have been rewarded. And I point him out as an example because you could have had a solution to some of your problems in-house. Now, it doesn't seem like Brett Berard is going to be much of an NHLer. We already discussed Brennan Othman. But you look at Hamalesh, you look at Noah Laba, and you look at Adam Sikora, all 3 of those guys could have been up earlier this year and gotten 50 to 70 games of NHL experience. But the Rangers, stubborn as they were, continued to try and win and develop at the same time. And it's ultimately why they are stuck here now. And I ran through it earlier, but the Bymon's record, I think, is really instructive because going into the new year, the Rangers were trending downward, but they were at the very least competitive. You know, like I said, 5-5-2 in October, 8-7 in November, 6-6-3 in December. That's not a great record. To be 19-18-5 is not very good. You know, 19-18-5 is under 500 if we're going by wins and losses cumulatively, but you're not out of it at that point. When you have Shesterkin and Fox both go on LTIR at the start of January, pretty much right after the Winter Classic, and you go 3-10-1, your season's over at that point. And the Rangers, very obviously, based on the way people have reported it and the way Artemi Panarin described it, they were never seriously entertaining the idea of keeping Panarin beyond this year because they understood they needed to start transitioning to a younger group and they needed to make ice time for guys like Perreault and others. But think about this. And I really am grateful the Rangers had that bottoming out month in January, because if they're hanging around through January and maybe they decide we're going to hold on to Panarin because we're going to try and make the playoffs this year, I'm very grateful that didn't happen. I really do wish they could have traded Trocheck already. I wish they would have traded Schneider. I hope they trade both of them this summer. I am open to trading pretty much anyone on this team right now, other than Shesterkin, other than Adam Fox. That's really it. And people will say, what about Perreault? What about Cooley? There are plenty of guys in the NHL I would trade both those guys for. How do you think the Rangers are going to get the mythical Brady Tkachuk trade done or the Austin Matthews trade done? Do you think the Maple Leafs are going to want a bunch of draft picks? No. They're going to want young NHL players with experience who have upside. Do I think the Rangers are getting Brady Tkachuk or Austin Matthews? Probably not. I think there are a lot of teams around the league who have better prospect pools, who have more talent at their disposal to execute those trades. I think you look at the way the Rangers' interest in Quinn Hughes was reported retroactively when Hughes ended up in Minnesota. The Rangers apparently were interested in Quinn Hughes, and maybe the trade is centered around Adam Fox for Quinn Hughes if the Rangers could have convinced Fox to waive his no trade clause, no movement clause, or you could have had a super pair of Fox and Hughes, or maybe you play them on different pairs. The Rangers didn't have anything close to what they got from Minnesota. But the players, the Zeev Blooms of the world, and the Marco Rossi and picks, the Rangers don't have a prospect of that caliber to headline a package. And a team like Toronto is going to want players who can play right away because they still have aging pieces who are getting paid. You don't want to waste the end of John Tavares' career. You don't want to waste William Nylander's prime if it were Austin Matthews. And month by month, think about this. The Rangers have Shesterkin this year, who, when he plays, is one of the 5 best goalies in the NHL. I think you can make a strong argument that over the last half decade, Shesterkin has consistently been the best goalie in the NHL. And look, I know Hellebuck has 2 Vezinas and the Hart Trophy in that window of contention, but I think you compare the workload and the expectations in Winnipeg versus in New York, and I think you can make a strong argument. The Rangers are a lot more contingent upon Hellebuck than the Jets were. And look, I know the Jets this year took a massive step back in part because Connor Hellebuck was injured and missed a lot of time, but I think the Jets have had more talented rosters top to bottom than the Rangers during this window, and I think it's made a little bit of the conversation of Hellebuck versus Shesterkin a bit more challenging. But this year, Shesterkin goes 25, 19, and 6. He has a 912 save percentage, which is top 10. He has a 2.5 goals against, which is also top 10. He's got 35 goals saved above expected, which is 5th best in the entire league. And this is a guy who only made 50-ish starts. 25 and 19 is 30, 44, and then 6. He's made 50 starts. I would love to see a world where Shesterkin gets the credibility. And it's very funny because you saw a lot of the conversation in the first half of this year being complaints about Shesterkin, his production relative to his contract. And then you saw what 1 month of the Rangers with bad NHL goaltending looked like, and they were the worst team in the league. As much as I lament that the Rangers wasted a year of Shesterkin, you also have to account for the fact you got a reality check. The Rangers, as constructed, are not competitive. And look, they're not competitive with Shesterkin, but without him, they are as bad as the Canucks. And when I bring up the idea of playing for appearances and caring more about reputation and identity than the results and the product, I think the way the Rangers handled this year, especially in terms of young guys getting opportunities, who they traded, when they traded them, I think there's a real argument to be made the Rangers wasted a season. Other than Gabe Perreault, the Rangers did not accomplish anything in their goals. Mika Zibanejad bouncing back and looking like an above average to borderline very good NHLer is a welcome change of pace. I thought after last year, Zibanejad was done as far as being an effective NHL player. And yes, Lafreniere and Perreault get credit for revigorating Zibanejad. A lot of the last year and change has been challenging for Zibanejad. Last year, he had the worst year of his career as a Ranger. They traded his best friend on the team in Chris Kreider this past offseason. And there were real questions about whether or not Zibanejad was going to be able to bounce back and salvage the back half of that 8-year deal he signed in 2021. I think Zibanejad on a Stanley Cup winning team is probably a second line center. I think the Rangers are probably an entire first line short of being at that contender level. And that's what's so frustrating about this year. The Rangers could have more or less shored up a good 2/3 of what their team would look like going into next year if they had optimized their lineup for understanding their players. And the fact that Trocheck is still here and he has been really bad this year. I was never particularly optimistic about Trocheck as a Ranger dating back to when they signed him. I always felt he was an imperfect understanding of their struggles. He's undoubtedly a better player than Ryan Strome. His contract isn't even that bad at $5.6 million. It's that he doesn't elevate. Other players elevate him. Trocheck having the best year of his life, the year Panarin goes for 49 goals and 120 points, that tells you Trocheck's limitations. We were talking about this earlier with Perreault, that he's probably going to need a better line mate if he wants to become a true superstar because he doesn't have the physical individual talents. You look at all of the bad penalties Trocheck took this year. I believe Trocheck, if I remember correctly, leads the Rangers in penalties this year amongst forwards. You look at the way JT Miller has been handled over the last year and change. And I talked about it last week on the show that JT Miller is really emblematic of the Rangers' shortcomings over the last 12 months, that he is a good hockey player, or at least was, and it's had basically no effect on the Rangers' results. The Rangers are under 500 with JT Miller in the lineup. This year, JT Miller played the entire season with a various assortment of injuries and was an active negative force on the team for good chunks of the year. He won his gold medal. He gets to posture a little bit. They gave him a token award for Mr. Ranger for his charity work, for donating some money. The Rangers desperately need JT Miller to look like a good hockey player again, as opposed to just appearing to be a hockey player. I think the fact the Rangers wrote a letter to the fans trying to crib the goodwill that Jeff Gorton had developed in the last decade from 2017 and effectively doing nothing. He got Liam Greentree, who probably at best is a Will Cooley facsimile, and maybe having a second Will Cooley's fine. The Rangers need more than that. That's what I'm so caught up on here, and why I keep reiterating this team probably needs 3 top 6 forwards and 2 top 4 defensemen if it's going to be competitive in the not so distant future. On no planet is that a retool. Now, I think there's definitely a world where they come back next year. The top 5 pick they get immediately comes into the lineup. JT Miller gets a full off season. He comes into camp in shape, and they're back in the playoffs next year. I think that's well within the realm of possibility. I also think people are going to delude themselves a little bit about what that means. And I think a lot of people are going to say, oh, they bounced back. They're back in the playoffs. They're fine. Even if JT Miller bounces back, even if the top 5 pick they add to the lineup is good right away, this team lacks a lot of pieces. And I want to see the Rangers learn from past mistakes. If the Rangers instantly try going back to being a contender next year, that's going to come at the detriment of Perreault's development. Whoever they draft first in the first round this upcoming year's development. I think anytime you were preoccupied with trying to do both, you end up doing neither. I think a lot about the Hawthorne quote in the college episode of The Sopranos, where Meadow is in an interview with someone from the admissions office, and Tony's sitting out in the lobby, and there's a quote up over the wall of a fireplace in the room. And I want to quote it accurately because it's really instructive for my problem with the way the Rangers have carried themselves the last few years. The quote is, "No man can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude without getting bewildered as to which may be true." The Rangers can say, we're retooling. They do not have the roster at present for retooling to be a viable path back to contention. And that should be the subheading under all of these columns about the Bruins, about the Capitals, these teams that have the 1 year down and then bounce back. I know the Capitals were one of the best teams in the East last year. Nobody was looking at Washington as a Stanley Cup contender last year. No one's looking at the Bruins right now and saying this team's going on a run. They're back in the playoffs. That's nice. That is an improvement. That's not winning. And yes, there is a trade-off there. You do need to make the playoffs consistently. You do need to weed out the weaker parts of your lineup over time, and you need playoff experience to judge who can perform in those big moments. But nobody thinks this Bruins team is going anywhere. Maybe they can win a round. They don't have the talent to hang with Tampa or Buffalo. I don't even know if the Bruins could beat the Hurricanes. And I think the Hurricanes are a really good example of this. The Hurricanes, who have been to the conference finals a bunch with Rob Brindamore, who have been probably the most consistent team in the Metropolitan Division this decade. I would say they've been arguably the best team in this division for the last 5 years. They are consistently in the second or third rounds of the playoffs. They have a pretty solid core of high-end, but not elite pieces, and they largely tinker around the edges because of the way their GM and the way their ownership operates, what they choose to spend money on and what they don't. I think Carolina is probably about as good as you can get in that trying to contend, but not good enough to. And I think that's the ceiling the Rangers are doomed to. I think the second Chris Drury looks at somebody like an Alex Tuch or goes into the trade market and tries to get Brady Tkachuk, I think going out and trying to trade for Brady Tkachuk, Austin Matthews, whoever you want to put in that spot, I think that is not solving the issue, because you're going to have to subtract from your team to get one of those guys. And the second you subtract from an already flawed team, you are becoming weaker. And people will argue in the counter, well, they got to subtract to add. And sure, you are burning daylight. You only have so many more elite years of Adam Fox and Igor Shesterkin to go. Every single season you waste of those guys is a missed opportunity. You have a top 5 defenseman and a top 5 goalie in the world, and you are a bottom 5 team in the NHL this year. That should be eye-opening for where you are at in the pecking order. And I know there will be the caveat, they were injured. Yes, they were injured. With them, they were still under 500 this year. That should be about as big a red flag for the entirety of the team around those guys as you could possibly imagine. And I'll leave you with this thought. Your goal as an NHL team is to have as many paths to victory as possible. You want to be able to win 5-4. You want to be able to win 2-1. You need to be able to create off the rush. You need to be able to create off the cycle. Some nights you're going to need your goalie to be your best player. Sometimes you're going to need that high-end forward who can wear down an opponent on the opposite ends, create zone entry after zone entry, and set up and work a hard cycle and create high to low. And well-rounded teams can win rock fights and they can win shootouts. The Rangers, for pretty much my entire life, have only been designed to win rock fights. When they get to those playoff series against the Tampa Bay Lightnings of the world, the Florida Panthers of the world, they lose every game 2-1 or 3-2. The Rangers do not have the juice to score 4 or 5 against those highly skilled defensive teams. And the more versatility you have, the more diversity in skill sets, the better your chances of adapting and responding to what happens in front of you. You look at the homogeny Chris Drury is prioritizing of grinders, forecheckers. There's not nearly enough skill here to be optimistic about this team's chances against a good team in a playoff series. And maybe you get why, with Shesterkin and Fox being your 2 best players. The Rangers have definitely done it before. You look at 22, 23, and 24. You can do that, but there is a ceiling. Until the Rangers acknowledge the ceiling of only comparing themselves against themselves and not the greater NHL, they are not going to break through. They are not going to learn their lessons. That will do it for the Theory of Hockey show this week. As I said earlier, we are going to do breakdowns, series by series, previews, pick them, X factors, give you a well-rounded perspective on all of the playoff series, what you need to know. so that you can brag and you can talk about puck with your friends. You can get involved. The community is growing. We're almost at 100 subs on YouTube with about 2 weeks of content, which is really exciting and great to see. The Substack is approaching 200 subscribers, which is great. The Discord server is a work in progress. I got to get more involved there. I got to get more bells and whistles to entice you to join. But the links for all of the community assets are down in the show notes to get involved. The playoffs start next week. By next Monday, we will be breaking down playoff hockey on the show. I will talk to you guys real soon when we start our playoff previews. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. I'll talk to you guys soon. And if you are still in the mix, if you are trying to limp into the playoffs, if you are trying to stave off elimination, best of luck, and may the odds forever be in your favor.